The candles had barely been lit when Lyra Voss felt the first crack of fear move through her chest. She stood behind the tall doors of the great hall, her wedding dress heavy with silver thread, her hands cold despite the warmth of the room beyond. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way she felt a storm before the first drop of rain touched the ground. Inside the hall, hundreds of guests waited. Alphas from every territory, healers, warriors, and common folk who had traveled for days to see their king finally take a mate. Damien Ashbourne was not just any man. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the largest wolf kingdom in the land, and for years, everyone believed Lyra would be the one standing beside him when he claimed his throne fully. She had grown up beside him. She had loved him quietly since she was a girl of 12, watching him train in the courtyard, admiring the way he protected the weak even before he understood what leadership meant. Now, on the day she had dreamed of for over a decade, her stomach twisted with dread instead of joy. Celine, her closest friend since childhood, squeezed her hand outside the doors. Celine wore a pale blue gown, simple compared to Lyra's wedding dress, and her eyes were bright with excitement. "You look like a queen already," Celine whispered. "Damien is a lucky man." Lyra tried to smile. "I just want this day to be over, so I can breathe again." Celine laughed softly and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Lyra's ear. "You've been waiting your whole life for this moment. Don't waste it being nervous." But Lyra's nerves were not about nervousness. They were about instinct. Wolves trusted their instincts above anything else, and hers were screaming. 20 minutes earlier, Damien had been called away by 3 members of his council. He had looked irritated, then confused, then strangely blank, as if something inside him had been switched off and another thing switched on. He had not returned to greet her before the ceremony, which was tradition for every alpha groom. Lyra had waited by the side chamber, watching the door, waiting for him to walk through and take her hand, the way he always did before anything important. He never came. Instead, an attendant arrived and told her the ceremony was ready to begin. Lyra pushed the fear down as the doors finally opened, and the sound of hundreds of voices quieting down washed over her like a wave. She began her walk down the aisle, flowers scattered beneath her feet, sunlight pouring through the high windows above. She kept her eyes on Damien, who stood at the altar in his ceremonial armor, the crown resting on his dark hair. But something was different in the way he watched her approach. His eyes, usually warm when they landed on her, were distant, clouded, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. Lyra told herself it was nerves. Kings were allowed nerves too. She reached the altar. The priest began the binding words, ancient words passed down through generations of wolf kings and queens, words that would tie her life to Damien's forever. Lyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the entire hall could hear it. Then Damien's hand, which was supposed to reach for hers, instead lifted and pointed toward the crowd. "Wait," he said, his voice rough, almost pained. "Stop the ceremony." Gasps rippled through the hall. The priest froze mid-sentence. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "Damien?" she whispered. He turned toward her, and for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked like grief, but then it vanished, replaced by a strange, glassy certainty. "I cannot do this," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "I cannot marry you, Lyra. My wolf has chosen someone else." The world tilted beneath Lyra's feet. She heard herself laugh, a short broken sound, because surely this was some kind of joke, some strange test of loyalty that alpha families sometimes played. But Damien did not laugh with her. He did not reach for her hand. He turned his head toward the crowd, and his eyes landed on Celine, who stood frozen near the front row, her face pale with shock. "Celine," Damien said, and the word left his mouth like a confession he could not hold back any longer. "You are my mate. I feel it. I feel the bond." The hall erupted into chaos. Voices rose all around Lyra, some shocked, some whispering, some already turning to stare at her with pity that felt worse than any insult. Celine stood frozen, shaking her head, mouthing the word no over and over, but Damien was already crossing the space between them, drawn forward as if pulled by an invisible rope. Lyra could not move. She stood at the altar in her wedding dress, abandoned mid-ceremony, watching the man she had loved her entire life declare himself bound to her best friend in front of the entire kingdom. She waited for someone to say something. Anything. For the priest to stop this madness. For the council to step in. For Damien to blink and come back to himself and apologize for whatever strange trick his mind had played on him. But nothing happened. Damien reached Celine and took her hand, and the crowd, stunned into silence moments before, began to murmur his name with something like awe, as if this cruel twist were simply fate revealing itself. Lyra's vision blurred. She realized distantly that she was crying, though she could not remember when the tears had started. She looked at Celine, silently begging her to say something, to refuse, to defend her. But Celine only stared back with wide, terrified eyes, as lost and confused as Lyra was. "I'm sorry," Celine mouthed, though whether she was apologizing for something she had done, or something being done to her, Lyra could not tell. Lyra could not stay another second in that hall. She turned, gathered the heavy fabric of her wedding gown into her fists, and walked back down the aisle she had just walked, with hope in her heart. Every step felt like walking through fire. Whispers followed her, some cruel, some pitying, all of them unbearable. She did not run. She refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her break completely. She held her spine straight until she reached the doors, and only once they closed behind her did she allow her legs to give out. She sank to the cold stone floor outside the hall, her dress pooling around her like spilled silver, and she pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. No one came after her. Not Damien, not Celine, not even the attendants who had helped her dress that morning with such joy in their voices. She was alone, utterly and completely, in the hallway of the castle she had once believed would become her home. After a long while, she forced herself to stand. Her mind was empty of thought, numb in a way she had never experienced before. She walked through the servant corridors, avoiding the main halls where guests still lingered in stunned conversation, and made her way outside into the palace gardens, where the cool evening air finally allowed her to breathe. The gardens were quiet at this hour, lit only by lanterns hanging from the trees and the soft glow of the rising moon. Lyra walked without direction, her bare feet cold against the stone path, her wedding shoes abandoned somewhere behind her. She did not care where she ended up. She only wanted distance from the hall, from the whispers, from the image of Damien's hand reaching for someone who was not her. She stopped near a small pond at the edge of the garden, staring at her reflection in the still water. Her makeup had smeared beneath her eyes. Her hair, once carefully pinned, hung loose around her shoulders. She looked like a stranger, someone who had lost everything in the span of a single hour. "You shouldn't be out here alone," a low voice said from the shadows. Lyra startled, spinning around, her heart still raw and unguarded. A man stood a few feet away, half hidden by the hanging branches of a willow tree. He was tall, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead, and even in the dim light, she could see the wound along his side, poorly bandaged, staining his shirt with dried blood. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "No one important," he said. "A traveler. I got caught in a fight outside the kingdom's border and wandered in here looking for somewhere quiet to rest." Lyra should have called for the guards. A wounded stranger, wandering the royal gardens on the night of a royal wedding, was reason enough for alarm. But something about him, the calm steadiness in his voice, the way he did not ask a single question about her tear-streaked face or her ruined wedding dress, made her stay. "You're bleeding," she said instead. "It looks worse than it is." He glanced down at his side, then back at her. "You look like you've had a harder night than I have." A broken laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "You have no idea." He did not push her to explain. He simply lowered himself onto a stone bench nearby, wincing slightly as he moved, and gestured to the space beside him. "You can sit if you want, or keep standing. Either way, I won't tell anyone I saw the woman in the silver dress crying by the pond." Lyra hesitated, then sat, keeping a careful distance between them. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind moving through the willow branches and the distant, muffled music still playing from the wedding feast that continued without her. "They didn't even stop," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. The music, the feast, everything just continued. "People rarely stop for someone else's pain," the stranger said, "even when they should." She looked at him properly then, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet steadiness in his eyes despite his injury. There was something familiar about him, though she was certain she had never met him before. Perhaps it was simply that he was the only person in the entire kingdom who had looked at her that night without pity or judgment, only quiet understanding. "I was supposed to be married tonight," she admitted. "I gathered that," he said gently, glancing at her dress. "He chose someone else, in front of everyone, my best friend." Saying it out loud made the wound feel fresh again, sharper than before. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry again in front of a stranger. "That's a special kind of cruelty," he said, and there was an edge of anger in his voice that surprised her, as if her pain had become his own for a moment. "It didn't feel like cruelty," Lyra whispered. "It felt like he wasn't even himself, like something had taken him over." The stranger went very still beside her. "What do you mean?" "His eyes," she said, shaking her head. "They looked clouded, distant, like he wasn't fully there. I've known him my whole life. I've never seen him look like that." The stranger did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as if he were choosing each word with purpose. Sometimes bonds are not as pure as people believe them to be. There are ways to force what should never be forced. Lyra turned to look at him fully. "What do you know about it?" "Only rumors," he said, and something in his expression closed off, retreating behind a wall she could not see past. Kingdoms are full of ambitious people who want power more than they want happiness for those they claim to serve. They sat together as the hours passed, the wedding music fading into silence, the lanterns burning lower, the moon climbing higher above the trees. Lyra found herself talking more than she intended, telling this stranger about her childhood beside Damien, about the years of quiet hope, about the friendship with Celine that now felt like a lie she hadn't seen coming. He listened without interrupting, without offering empty comfort, simply present, in a way that made the unbearable weight of the night feel slightly less crushing. At some point, exhaustion overtook grief, and Lyra found herself leaning slightly against the stone bench, her eyes growing heavy. The stranger did not move away. He stayed beside her, a quiet, steady presence through the darkest hours of the night, asking nothing of her, offering nothing but his company. When the first hint of gray light touched the sky, Lyra startled awake, disoriented, her body stiff from the cold stone bench. She looked beside her, but the space where the stranger had been sitting was empty. There was no sign of him, no trace that anyone had been there at all, except for a single dark green leaf resting on the bench where his hand had rested hours before. She stood slowly, her mind clearing as the weight of the previous night crashed back over her. The wedding, Damien's rejection, Celine's stunned, guilty face, the stranger who had sat with her through the darkest hours and vanished before dawn. Something inside her shifted in that moment, quiet but absolute. She could not stay in this kingdom. She could not walk through these halls again, past whispering servants and pitying nobles, past the room where her wedding dress still hung, past the life she had built around a man who had chosen someone else in front of everyone she had ever known. She made her decision before the sun had fully risen. Lyra returned to her chambers through the quiet servant corridors, moving quickly and silently, years of instinct guiding her steps without conscious thought. She changed out of her ruined wedding dress and into simple traveling clothes, packing only what she could carry easily: a small bag with a few belongings, some coins she had saved over the years, nothing that would slow her down or draw attention. She paused only once, standing in the doorway of her chamber, looking back at the room that had been hers since childhood. A part of her wanted to leave a note, some explanation for her disappearance, but she could not think of a single word that would capture the depth of what had been taken from her that night. Let them wonder. Let them search. She owed no explanation to a kingdom that had watched her walk out of that hall without a single person stepping forward to stop her humiliation. She slipped out through the servants' gate just as the first true light of morning broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of soft gold and rose. The guards at the outer wall, exhausted from the previous night's celebrations, barely glanced at the young woman in simple traveling clothes moving quickly toward the forest road. Lyra did not look back at the castle rising behind her, its towers catching the early light, its halls still holding the echoes of a wedding that never finished. She kept her eyes forward, on the road ahead, on the life she would have to build from nothing, in a place where no one knew her name or her history. By the time the kingdom stirred fully awake, by the time servants discovered her empty chamber, and the missing wedding dress crumpled in the corner, by the time whispers began to spread that the rejected bride had vanished sometime in the night, Lyra Voss was already miles away, walking a road that led toward an uncertain future, carrying with her a grief too heavy for words, and a secret she did not yet know she carried at all. She did not know that the wounded stranger, who had sat beside her through the darkest hours of her life, was more than he appeared to be. She did not know that his presence that night would shape the rest of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. She only knew that she had to leave, that staying meant drowning in humiliation she had not earned, and that somewhere ahead of her, beyond the borders of everything familiar, there had to be a place where she could breathe again. The kingdom of Ashbourne would spend weeks searching for her, sending riders down every road, questioning every traveler who might have seen a woman fitting her description. But Lyra had learned enough about survival, from a lifetime spent near warriors and hunters, to know how to disappear when she truly wanted to. And she wanted to disappear more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. As the morning sun rose fully over the kingdom she left behind, Lyra Voss walked on, unaware that within her, a new life had already begun to take root, one that would eventually bring her back to the very kingdom she was fleeing, carrying with her a truth that would shake the throne of Ashbourne to its foundations. 3 weeks after leaving the kingdom of Ashbourne, Lyra Voss stood at the edge of a small human town called Fernbrook, staring at a cottage with a crooked roof and a garden overgrown with weeds. It was not much, but it was hers, bought with the last of her savings, and a story she had invented about being a widow seeking a quiet life. No one in Fernbrook knew she was a wolf. No one knew she had once nearly married a king. Here, she was simply Lyra, a healer with steady hands and a guarded past. The road to Fernbrook had not been easy. She had traveled mostly at night, avoiding the main paths where riders from Ashbourne might search for her, sleeping in abandoned barns and hollowed trees, surviving on what little food she could forage or trade for with the coin she carried. Every mile had chipped away at the girl she used to be, the one who believed in fairy tale endings and childhood promises. By the time she reached Fernbrook, she was someone else entirely, someone harder, someone who trusted nothing and no one. She settled into the cottage slowly, repairing what she could with her own hands, learning the rhythms of a town that had never heard of alpha kings, or mate bonds, or betrayal disguised as destiny. The townspeople were kind, in a simple, uncomplicated way. They asked few questions, grateful for a healer who charged fair prices and worked long hours without complaint. Lyra buried herself in the work, using it as a shield against the grief that still threatened to swallow her whole in quiet moments. It was nearly a month after her arrival when she first noticed the changes in her body. She had dismissed the exhaustion at first, blaming it on the stress of building a new life from nothing. She dismissed the nausea as poor food, the tenderness in her chest as fatigue. But when her monthly cycle failed to arrive for the second time, a cold, sinking realization settled over her, one she could no longer ignore. She sat alone in her cottage late one evening, staring at her own reflection in a cracked mirror, pressing a trembling hand against her stomach. Wolves carried differently than humans. Their instincts were sharper, their bodies quicker to signal change. And Lyra's instincts, the same ones that had warned her something was wrong on her wedding day, were now telling her something impossible to deny. She was carrying a child. Her mind raced backward through the weeks, searching for an explanation, and landed, inevitably, on the night in the garden, the wounded stranger, the hours spent sitting beside him beneath the willow tree, exhausted and grieving, her guard lowered in a way it had never been lowered for anyone outside her closest circle. She remembered little of the specifics of that night beyond conversation, beyond the quiet comfort of not being alone in her pain, but wolf bonds and wolf instincts worked in ways that defied simple explanation. Something had happened between them, something neither of them had planned or fully understood, drawn together by grief and loneliness, and the strange pull that sometimes existed between wolves in crisis. Lyra pressed her palms against her eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of what this meant. She was alone, in a town where no one knew her true nature, carrying a child whose father was a stranger she could not name, could not find, and who had vanished from her life as quickly and mysteriously as he had entered it. For a long while, panic threatened to consume her entirely. She thought of returning to Ashbourne, of seeking help from the healers, who had once cared for her, But the thought of walking back into that kingdom, of facing Damien and Celine, and the whispers that would surely follow her, was unbearable. She thought of writing to her own family, but her parents had passed years earlier, and the few distant relatives she had left were tied closely enough to the royal court that word would inevitably reach the wrong ears. She was truly, completely alone. But as the initial shock faded, something steadier took its place. Lyra had spent her entire life believing her worth was tied to the love and approval of others, to Damien's affection, to her place at his side. That belief had been shattered in a single cruel moment at the altar. Now, faced with the reality of carrying a child entirely on her own, she felt something unfamiliar stir within her: determination. She would not crumble. She would not return to a kingdom that had humiliated her, hoping for scraps of pity or assistance. She would build a life for this child with her own hands, in her own way, far from the politics and cruelty of royal courts and broken promises. The following months tested every ounce of that determination. Her pregnancy progressed differently than the human women in Fernbrook expected, her body changing faster, her senses sharpening in ways she had to carefully hide from curious neighbors. She wore looser clothing earlier than necessary, invented excuses for her increased appetite, and practiced controlling the flickers of gold that sometimes crossed her eyes when her emotions ran high, a telltale sign of wolf blood that no human in this town could be allowed to witness. She continued her work as a healer for as long as she safely could, though she reduced her hours as her pregnancy advanced, relying on the modest savings she had built and the kindness of a few townspeople who had grown genuinely fond of her during her time in Fernbrook. An older widow named Margaret, who lived 2 houses down, took a particular interest in Lyra's well-being, bringing meals and checking in without asking the invasive questions Lyra dreaded. "You carry that baby alone," Margaret said one afternoon, settling into a chair across from Lyra's kitchen table. "But you don't have to carry the loneliness alone too. Whatever happened to you before you came here, it doesn't have to define the rest of your life." Lyra managed a small smile, grateful for the kindness, even as she kept the deeper truths hidden. "Thank you, Margaret. I mean that." As the months passed, Lyra began to notice something strange during her check-ins with the town's aging midwife, a kind but increasingly puzzled woman named Edith. The size of Lyra's growing stomach, the intensity of movement she felt within her, the sheer physical exhaustion that seems disproportionate even for a difficult pregnancy, all pointed toward something Edith could not quite explain with her limited human medical knowledge. "I've delivered many babies in my years," Edith told her during one visit, pressing gently against Lyra's stomach with careful hands. "But I have never felt anything quite like this. There's more movement than I would expect from a single child." Lyra's heart stopped for a moment. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind, that something felt different about this pregnancy, compared to what she understood of typical wolf pregnancies, but she had pushed the thought away, unwilling to confront one more overwhelming reality, on top of everything else she was already facing. "What do you mean?" Lyra asked carefully. Edith frowned, pressing again at a different angle. "I cannot be entirely certain without proper equipment, but if I had to guess, based on what I'm feeling, and the rate at which you've grown these past months, I would say you may be carrying more than one child." The words settled over Lyra like a physical weight. Twins. She was carrying twins, alone, in a small human town, with a father she could not name, and a past she could never fully explain to anyone around her. That night, after Edith left, Lyra sat alone in her cottage, long after the sun had set, one hand resting against the curve of her stomach, feeling the flutter of movement beneath her palm, undeniable now that she knew what to look for. 2 heartbeats. 2 lives depending entirely on her strength, her ability to protect them from a world that had already shown her how cruel it could be. She thought, briefly and painfully, of Damien, wondering what he was doing at that exact moment, whether he had settled fully into his bond with Celine, whether the kingdom had already moved past the scandal of the rejected bride who vanished without explanation. She wondered if anyone still searched for her, or if her disappearance had simply become another piece of court gossip, discussed and eventually forgotten. She thought too of the stranger from the garden, wondering where he was, whether he had survived his injuries, whether he had any idea that the woman he sat with through one long, painful night now carried the proof of that connection within her body. She did not even know his name. She had no way to find him, No way to tell him what had come from those quiet hours beneath the willow tree. Lyra pressed both hands against her stomach now, feeling the twin lives moving within her, and made a silent promise into the darkness of her small cottage. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I will protect you both, no matter what it costs me." The remaining months of her pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and quiet strength. She converted the small second room of her cottage into a nursery, sewing what she could by hand, and trading healing services for items she could not make herself. Margaret and a few other kind neighbors helped where they could, never prying too deeply into the absence of a father, respecting the walls Lyra had carefully built around her past. As her due date approached, Lyra found herself both terrified and strangely calm. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, and complete abandonment by everyone she once trusted, and she had survived. She told herself she could survive this too, that she was stronger than the frightened bride who had fled a wedding hall in the dead of night. The labor came on a cold evening in early winter, sudden and intense, in a way that left little room for gentle preparation. Edith arrived quickly, along with Margaret, who refused to leave Lyra's side despite having no obligation to stay through such a difficult and uncertain birth. The hours that followed blurred into pain and effort and desperate determination, Lyra drawing on every ounce of wolf strength she had spent months hiding, allowing her true nature to surface fully for the first time since arriving in Fernbrook. When it was finally over, when the small cottage filled with the sound of not one but two distinct cries, Lyra felt something break open inside her chest, not from pain, but from an overwhelming flood of love so intense it nearly stole her breath entirely. A boy and a girl. Both healthy, both strong, both bearing unmistakable traces of something beyond ordinary human infants, something Edith and Margaret noticed immediately, in the strange golden shimmer that crossed their newborn eyes, before quickly fading, something they were both too kind and too stunned to comment on directly. Lyra held her children against her chest, exhaustion and joy warring within her, tears streaming freely down her face. For the first time in months, she had done it. She had survived everything the world had thrown at her, and she had brought 2 new lives into existence, lives she would protect with everything she had, regardless of the truth she still could not fully explain, regardless of the kingdom she had left behind, regardless of the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. She named them that same night, whispering the names softly against their small, warm heads. A boy she called Kai, strong and steady like the roots of an ancient tree. A girl she called Wren, delicate but fierce, like the small bird that sang loudest, even in the coldest winter. Outside the cottage, snow began to fall gently over Fernbrook, blanketing the small town in quiet white silence. Inside, Lyra Voss held her twin children close, no longer the heartbroken bride who had fled a kingdom in shame, but a mother now, fierce and unbreakable, ready to face whatever the future demanded of her, to keep her children safe. She did not know, in that quiet, exhausted moment of new motherhood, that hundreds of miles away, in the halls of Ashbourne Kingdom, the man she once loved had begun to sense that something in his life had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. A crash of pottery against stones startled Lyra awake before dawn, and she bolted upright, heart pounding, before realizing it was only Kai, now 3 years old, who had knocked a bowl off the kitchen table while chasing after his sister. Wren giggled from beneath the table, her golden eyes flashing briefly, before settling back into their usual soft brown, a trait Lyra had learned to watch carefully and correct whenever strangers were near. "Both of you, quiet," Lyra said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only the practiced patience of a mother who had grown used to chaos. She scooped up the broken pottery pieces while Kai apologized with exaggerated sincerity, his small face scrunched with the kind of dramatic guilt only a toddler could manage. 3 years had passed since that snowy night when Kai and Wren entered the world, and Fernbrook had become, against all odds, a genuine home. Lyra had built a modest but steady life for her small family, her healing skills earning enough trust and income to keep them comfortable, if not wealthy. The cottage had expanded slightly over the years, a second room added for the growing twins, a small garden now flourishing where weeds had once dominated. But peace, Lyra had learned, was rarely permanent for someone like her. The twins were unlike any children Fernbrook had ever seen, and despite Lyra's constant vigilance, certain truths proved impossible to hide entirely. Kai had begun climbing trees at heights no toddler should safely manage, moving with a balance and speed that made the other town children stare in open astonishment. Ren, quieter but no less remarkable, had an uncanny ability to sense approaching weather, tugging at Lyra's sleeve hours before storms rolled in, her small nose wrinkling at scents no human child could possibly detect. Lyra worked constantly to explain away these oddities, blaming Kai's agility on natural athleticism, dismissing Ren's weather sense as simple coincidence repeated one too many times. Most of Fernbrook accepted these explanations without much scrutiny, content to view the twins as simply unusual, gifted children born to a private, hard-working mother. But not everyone in Fernbrook was so easily satisfied. Lyra first noticed the stranger watching her cottage on a quiet afternoon in late spring, a man she did not recognize standing near the edge of the town square, his eyes tracking Kai and Ren as they played in the small garden. He wore travel-worn clothing, nothing that marked him as anything other than an ordinary passerby, but something about the way he watched, patient and calculating rather than simply curious, sent a familiar chill of instinct through Lyra's body. She gathered the twins inside immediately, offering no explanation beyond a firm insistence that playtime was over, and watched from behind the curtains as the stranger lingered a while longer before finally moving on down the road. She told herself it was nothing. Travelers passed through Fernbrook regularly, and not every curious glance was cause for alarm, but the unease lingered, settling into her chest like a stone she could not fully dislodge. 2 weeks later, the stranger appeared again, this time speaking quietly with the town blacksmith, gesturing occasionally toward the direction of Lyra's cottage. When Lyra passed the blacksmith shop later that same day, gathering supplies for a healing salve, the blacksmith mentioned, almost in passing, that a traveler had been asking questions about a woman and her 2 children, mentioning details that made Lyra's blood run cold. Said he was looking for a healer with twins, the blacksmith explained, unaware of the alarm building behind Lyra's carefully neutral expression. Said it might be an old friend of his, someone he lost touch with years back. Didn't seem dangerous, just curious. Lyra thanked him, and left quickly, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. She had been careful, so carefully, to leave no trail back to Ashbourne, to avoid any mention of her past that might draw unwanted attention. But wolf kingdoms had long reaches, and twins born with unmistakable alpha traits, however subtly displayed, were the kind of secret that eventually found ways to surface. That night, after putting Kai and Ren to bed, Lyra sat awake at her kitchen table, staring at the small flame of a single candle, turning over every possibility in her mind. Perhaps the stranger was simply what he claimed, an old acquaintance searching for a lost friend, someone with no connection to the dangers she feared. Or perhaps word had finally reached beyond Fernbrook's borders, drawing the kind of attention that could unravel everything she had built to protect her children. She decided, that night, that she could no longer rely solely on hope and careful deception to keep her family safe. She needed a plan, contingencies, ways to disappear quickly if the situation demanded it. Over the following weeks, Lyra began quietly preparing an emergency store of supplies, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the twins' bedroom, enough coin and essential items to allow for swift departure if necessary. She taught Kai and Ren, in ways appropriate for their young age, simple rules to follow if she ever told them it was time to move quickly and quietly, framing it as an adventure game rather than the desperate safety measure it truly was. The stranger did not appear again for nearly a month, and Lyra allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that the danger had passed, that whoever had been asking questions had moved on to search elsewhere, or had simply lost interest. But hope, she had learned long ago, was a fragile and often unreliable companion. It was a warm evening in early summer, when Lyra returned from a healing visit at the edge of town, to find her cottage door standing slightly ajar, though she was certain she had locked it securely before leaving. Her heart lurched painfully as she rushed inside, calling out for Kai and Ren, relief flooding through her when she found them both safe, playing quietly in their room under the watchful eye of Margaret, who had agreed to look after them for the afternoon. "Everything's fine," Margaret assured her quickly, noticing the panic in Lyra's expression. "The door must have blown open. I only just noticed it myself." Lyra forced herself to breathe evenly, though instinct told her the door had not simply blown open on a still summer evening, with barely a breeze to speak of. She thanked Margaret, saw her out with careful composure, and once alone with her children, conducted a thorough search of the cottage, checking every corner, every hiding place, searching for any sign that someone had been inside. She found nothing disturbed, nothing missing, no clear evidence of intrusion, beyond her own instinctive certainty that something was wrong. But that certainty was enough. Wolves did not survive by ignoring their instincts, and Lyra's instincts had never failed her. Not once. Not even on the night everything in her life had shattered at that altar years ago. That night, after the twins were finally asleep, Lyra stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the quiet, moonlit street of Fernbrook, a town that had given her 3 years of peace but could no longer promise safety, not with someone actively searching for her, someone who had grown bold enough to enter her home uninvited. She thought of Kai's easy laughter, of Wren's quiet intelligence, of the small, ordinary life she had built for them despite everything working against her. She had wanted, more than anything, to give them a normal childhood, free from the politics and danger that had defined her own younger years. But normal, she was beginning to understand, might never truly be possible for children carrying the blood they carried, regardless of how carefully she tried to hide it. Over the following days, Lyra grew increasingly vigilant, watching every stranger who passed through town with careful, guarded attention, keeping Kai and Wren closer than usual, cutting short their outdoor playtime, despite their confused protests. The easy rhythm of their small life together grew strained under the weight of her mounting fear. It was Kai, with the innocent bluntness only a young child could manage, who finally voiced the question that had been building in Lyra's mind for weeks. "Mama," he asked one evening, looking up at her with wide, curious eyes as she tucked him into bed, "are we in trouble?" Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She smoothed his dark hair back gently, choosing her words with careful precision. "No, sweetheart. Mama just wants to make sure we're always safe. That's all." Kai accepted the explanation with the simple trust of a child, drifting off to sleep moments later, but Lyra remained beside his bed long after, watching him and Wren sleep peacefully, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around the safe, small world their mother had worked so hard to build for them. She knew, with growing certainty, that Fernbrook could no longer offer the safety it once had. Whoever was searching for her, whether connected to Ashbourne or driven by some other unknown motive, had found their way closer than she could safely ignore. The question was no longer whether she needed to prepare for the possibility of leaving, but how much time remained before that possibility became an unavoidable necessity. Lyra spent the following nights reinforcing her emergency plans, memorizing alternate routes out of Fernbrook, identifying which of her modest possessions were truly essential, and which could be left behind without regret. She said nothing further to Kai and Wren, beyond the simple, disguised safety games she had already introduced, unwilling to burden their young minds with fears they were too small to fully understand. 3 days later, her fears crystallized into undeniable reality. Lyra was returning from the market, with Wren perched on her hip and Kai walking dutifully beside her, when she spotted the same stranger from weeks before standing near the edge of the town square once more, this time in close conversation with a second man she did not recognize, both of them dressed in clothing too fine and too clean for simple travelers passing through a small, unremarkable town like Fernbrook. Her wolf instincts flared immediately, sharp and undeniable, recognizing something in their posture, their bearing, that spoke unmistakably of trained warriors rather than ordinary wanderers. Lyra changed direction immediately, guiding Kai quickly down a side street, her heart pounding as she fought to keep her expression calm for her children's sake. She did not look back to confirm whether the men had noticed her, focusing entirely on reaching the cottage quickly and quietly. Once inside, she bolted the door firmly, gathered Kai and Wren close, and made the decision she had been dreading for weeks. It was time to leave Fernbrook. She spent that entire night packing swiftly and silently, waking her sleepy, confused children well before dawn, whispering gentle reassurances as she guided them out of the only home they had ever known, carrying the small emergency bag she had prepared weeks before, along with as many additional supplies as she could reasonably manage. As the first gray light of morning touched the horizon, Lyra Voss walked away from Fernbrook with her twin children beside her, uncertain of where they would go next, only certain that staying any longer would put Kai and Wren directly in the path of dangers she was not yet prepared to face. Behind her, the quiet town that had sheltered her small family for 3 peaceful years grew smaller and smaller in the distance, another chapter of her carefully hidden life closing behind her, while somewhere ahead, an uncertain and dangerous future waited, drawing steadily closer with every step she took. Damien Ashbourne woke gasping, his chest heaving, his sheets soaked through with sweat, though the night was cool. It was the same dream again, the 3rd time that week. Lyra standing at the altar in her silver dress, her eyes wide with betrayal, her mouth moving with words he could never quite hear before he jolted awake. 3 years had passed since that wedding day. 3 years since he had stood before his entire kingdom and pointed toward Celine, instead of the woman he had loved since childhood. And still, the dream refused to let him rest. He sat up slowly, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. Beside him, the bed was empty. Celine rarely shared his chambers anymore, a fact that had become an unspoken truth neither of them addressed directly. Their bond, declared so publicly and dramatically on his wedding day, had never felt right. Not once. Not in 3 years of trying to force it into something real. Damien rose and dressed quietly, moving through the dark halls of the castle, toward the private study, where he had spent countless sleepless nights over the past several months. He had begun, quietly and without informing his council, an investigation into the events of his own wedding day, driven by a growing certainty that something about that night had been fundamentally, irreversibly wrong. He remembered fragments. Being called away by 3 senior council members shortly before the ceremony, a private meeting in a sealed chamber, the details of which grew hazier the harder he tried to recall them. A strange, bitter taste lingering on his tongue afterward. And then, standing at the altar beside Lyra, feeling something inside him twist and shift, an overwhelming, undeniable pull toward Celine that he had believed, in that disoriented moment, was the sacred mate bond every alpha wolf was destined to experience. But mate bonds did not feel the way his connection to Celine had felt over the following years. True bonds, according to every account he had ever studied, grew stronger with time, deepening into something unshakable. What he shared with Celine had done the opposite, growing weaker, more strained, more clearly artificial with every passing month, until now, 3 years later, they existed as little more than polite strangers, sharing a title and a crown. Damien settled into the chair behind his desk and pulled out the small stack of documents he had been quietly gathering, testimonies from servants who had been present in the castle that day, records of unusual purchases made by certain council members in the weeks leading up to the wedding, notes on rare herbs known for their ability to disrupt a wolf's natural instincts and manufacture false emotional responses. The evidence, piece by piece, painted a picture he had refused to fully accept until recently. He had been drugged, deliberately, carefully drugged by members of his own council in the moments before his wedding, manipulated into believing a false bond with Celine that served their political interests far more than it served his own heart or his kingdom's true well-being. He thought of Lyra constantly now, wondering where she had gone, whether she was safe, whether she had ever forgiven him for the public humiliation he had inflicted upon her, even if he had not been fully in control of his own actions that day. He had sent quiet search parties out over the years, careful not to draw attention from his council, but every trail had gone cold within weeks of her disappearance. Lyra had vanished as thoroughly and completely as if the earth itself had swallowed her. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. He quickly gathered the documents into a locked drawer before calling for whoever waited outside to enter. Celine stepped into the room, wrapped in a simple robe, her expression carrying the same careful distance that had defined their interactions for years now. "You're awake early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," Damien replied, offering no further explanation. Celine lingered near the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. "The council wants to discuss the trade agreements with the Eastern Territories again. They're pushing for a decision by the end of the week." Damien nodded absently, though his mind remained fixed on the documents locked away in his desk. "I'll review it." Celine studied him for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her expression. "Damien, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about her? About Lyra?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had likely intended. Damien met Celine's gaze directly, deciding, after 3 years of careful avoidance, that honesty was long overdue between them. Every day, he admitted quietly. Celine's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected for a long time. I think about her too, she said. I've never stopped feeling guilty about what happened that day. I know it wasn't entirely my choice, or yours, but I still see her face sometimes, right before she left the hall. You've felt it too, haven't you? Damien asked carefully. That something about our bond has never felt right. Celine nodded slowly, relief evident in her expression, as if she had been waiting years for someone to finally acknowledge the truth openly. I thought it was just me. I thought maybe I wasn't trying hard enough, or that bonds simply took longer to settle for some couples. It's not you, Damien said firmly. I believe we were both manipulated that day. I've been gathering evidence for months. I believe certain members of my council drugged me deliberately, forcing a false bond between us, to secure some political advantage I haven't fully uncovered yet. Celine's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and something like vindication crossing her face. Who would do something so cruel? I don't know yet, Damien admitted, but I intend to find out. Over the following weeks, Damien and Celine worked together quietly, united now by a shared desire to uncover the truth, rather than divided by a false bond neither of them had chosen. Their alliance, stripped of the pressure of forced romance, settled into something more honest, a genuine friendship, built on mutual understanding, rather than manufactured destiny. Celine proved invaluable in the investigation, using her position within the castle to gather information Damien could not easily access himself, quietly questioning servants and staff who had witnessed the events leading up to the wedding, cross-referencing schedules and movements that gradually revealed a clearer picture of what had truly happened that day. The trail led, eventually and unavoidably, to Councilman Edric Thorne, the most senior and trusted member of Damien's council, a man who had served the Ashbourne throne since before Damien himself was born. Edric had long advocated for stronger political ties with Celine's family, whose territory controlled critical trade routes along the eastern border, routes that had grown increasingly valuable as tensions with neighboring kingdoms escalated over recent years. A marriage between Damien and Lyra, the daughter of a respected but politically insignificant family, offered the kingdom nothing beyond sentiment and childhood loyalty. A marriage between Damien and Celine, however, secured immediate and lasting political advantage, strengthening Ashbourne's position along a vulnerable border and ensuring continued access to trade routes that had become essential to the kingdom's growing wealth. Damien sat with this knowledge for several sleepless nights, anger building steadily beneath his controlled exterior. Edric had not simply advised him toward a politically favorable marriage, a common enough practice among ruling families. He had stolen Damien's ability to choose entirely, manipulating his mind and body through forbidden herbs, forcing a false bond that had caused irreparable harm to at least 3 lives, Damien's own, Celine's, and most painfully, Lyra's. We need proof before we act, Celine cautioned one evening, as they reviewed their gathered evidence together in Damien's study. Edric has powerful allies within the council. If we move too soon without solid proof, he could easily turn the situation against us, claim we're fabricating accusations to cover our own personal dissatisfaction with the marriage. Damien nodded, forcing himself to remain patient despite the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Then we gather proof carefully, whatever it takes. Their investigation continued through the following months, slow and methodical, uncovering additional evidence that confirmed Edric's involvement beyond reasonable doubt. A servant, previously too frightened to speak openly, finally confessed to witnessing Edric personally overseeing preparation of a specific tea served to Damien shortly before the wedding ceremony, a tea unlike anything typically served on such occasions. A merchant, questioned carefully and discreetly by Celine, confirmed selling Edric rare herbal ingredients, known throughout wolf medicine for their ability to disrupt natural bonding instincts, ingredients with no legitimate purpose beyond the manipulation Damien now suspected. Piece by piece, the evidence built into an undeniable case against Edric Thorne, revealing not just a single act of manipulation, but a carefully orchestrated plan, spanning months of preparation, all designed to secure Edric's preferred political outcome, regardless of the personal devastation it caused. Throughout this growing investigation, Damien's thoughts returned constantly to Lyra, to the possibility that somewhere, she was still alive, still carrying the weight of that humiliating public rejection, without ever knowing the truth behind it. He intensified his private search efforts, expanding the reach of his most trusted scouts, offering substantial rewards for any credible information regarding her whereabouts. Months passed without success, until finally, nearly 3.5 years after that devastating wedding day, one of Damien's most trusted scouts returned with information that made his heart stop entirely. A small human town called Fernbrook, several days' ride from Ashbourne's borders, had recently experienced a sudden and unexplained departure of a young healer and her 2 young children, a woman matching Lyra's description in remarkable detail. Twins. Damien sat frozen at his desk, staring at the scout's report, doing the mathematics in his mind with a growing, disbelieving certainty. The timing aligned perfectly with Lyra's disappearance. The description matched her exactly. And twins, born to a woman who had vanished from Ashbourne Kingdom the very night of her rejected wedding, carrying children who would be roughly the right age to have been conceived around that same devastating time. "Celine," Damien called out, his voice unsteady in a way it rarely was. "I need you to see this." Celine entered quickly, reading the report over his shoulder, her own expression shifting rapidly from confusion to shock as the implications settled over her. "Damien," she said slowly, "do you think—" "I don't know," he admitted, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "But I intend to find out." That same night, Damien gathered a small, trusted group of warriors, informing only Celine and a handful of his most loyal advisors of his true destination. He could not yet move openly against Edric Thorne without solid, undeniable proof capable of withstanding the council's scrutiny. But he could, quietly and without drawing attention, follow this new lead toward the woman he had never stopped loving, and toward the possibility of children he had not known existed until this very moment. As he prepared to depart Ashbourne Kingdom before dawn the following morning, Damien allowed himself, for the first time in over 3 years, a fragile, cautious flicker of hope. Hope that somewhere ahead of him, Lyra was still alive, still safe, and that the truth he had fought so hard to uncover might finally offer both of them a chance at the life that had been so cruelly stolen from them on their wedding day. He had no way of knowing, as he rode out from the castle gates into the pale, early morning light, that Lyra herself had already fled Fernbrook days earlier, driven away by dangers of her own, and that the path ahead of him would prove far more complicated and dangerous than a simple reunion waiting patiently at the end of a quiet road. Branches snapped somewhere behind them in the darkness, and Lyra pulled Kai and Ren closer against her sides, her heart hammering as she scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. They had been walking for 2 straight days since leaving Fernbrook, sleeping only in short, uneasy bursts, surviving on the dried food Lyra had packed in her hurried departure. The children, exhausted and confused by the sudden upheaval of their quiet lives, had stopped asking questions somewhere around midday, sensing without needing words that their mother's fear was real and immediate. "Mama, I'm tired," Ren whispered, her small voice trembling slightly as she stumbled over an exposed root along the forest path. "I know, sweetheart," Lyra murmured, scooping her daughter up despite her own exhaustion, balancing Ren against her hip while keeping a firm grip on Kai's hand. "We'll rest soon, I promise." She had chosen the forest path deliberately, knowing the dense trees would slow pursuit and mask their scent trail better than the open road. But 2 days of travel had left her body aching with fatigue, her senses dulled just enough that she nearly missed the subtle shift in the air around them, the too quiet stillness that meant something was watching from the shadows. She stopped abruptly, pulling Kai and Ren behind her instinctively, her eyes narrowing as she searched the darkness pressing in around them. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A figure emerged from between the trees ahead, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate, controlled steps of a trained hunter. Behind Lyra, another set of footsteps crunched softly against fallen leaves, confirming her worst fear. They were surrounded. "There's no need for this to become difficult," the man ahead of her said, his voice calm and measured, in a way that somehow made the situation feel more dangerous rather than less. "We only want the children." Lyra's blood ran cold. She positioned herself fully between the twins and the approaching men, her hands curling into fists at her sides, every protective instinct she possessed rising sharply to the surface. "You will not touch them," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. That decision isn't entirely yours to make, the man replied, taking another slow step forward. Their blood belongs to a kingdom far more powerful than whatever protection you think you can offer them. Behind her, Kai whimpered softly, and Ren pressed herself tightly against Lyra's leg, both children sensing the danger without fully understanding it. Lyra's mind raced desperately through her limited options. She was outnumbered, exhausted from 2 days of travel, and burdened with protecting 2 frightened children rather than simply herself. Fighting seemed impossible. Running seemed equally hopeless with men positioned on multiple sides. "Please," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Whatever you think you know about them, you're wrong. They're just children. They're heirs to a bloodline that matters far beyond your understanding," the man said, closing the distance further. "Come quietly, and no harm needs to come to you." Lyra's wolf instincts flared violently at the implicit threat beneath his words, every protective impulse screaming at her to fight, regardless of the impossible odds stacked against her. She shifted her weight, preparing to defend her children with whatever strength she had left, when a sudden, powerful growl erupted from the darkness beside her, low and threatening enough to make even the approaching hunters freeze in their tracks. A large wolf, dark-furred and powerfully built, emerged from the shadows between Lyra and the nearest hunter, positioning itself protectively in front of her and the twins, teeth bared in an unmistakable warning. The hunters exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not expecting additional resistance. The lead hunter reached for a weapon at his side, but before he could fully draw it, the wolf lunged forward with startling speed, forcing him backward with a snarl that echoed sharply through the quiet forest. Chaos erupted around them. Lyra pulled Kai and Ren tightly against her, shielding them as best she could, while the powerful wolf engaged the hunters with fierce, calculated aggression, moving with the kind of skilled precision that spoke of extensive combat experience rather than simple animal instinct. Within moments, the remaining hunters, clearly unprepared for such determined resistance, retreated into the darkness, their footsteps fading quickly as they abandoned their pursuit rather than risk further injury against an opponent far more capable than they had anticipated. Silence settled back over the forest, broken only by Lyra's ragged breathing and the frightened whimpers of her children. The large wolf turned toward them slowly, its posture shifting from aggressive to cautious, before beginning the familiar rippling transformation that marked a shift back into human form. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the man before her came fully into focus in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Dark hair, sharp features, and unmistakably, the same steady, calm presence she remembered from a garden bench years earlier, on the worst night of her life. "You," she whispered, disbelief washing over her exhausted mind. The stranger from the wedding night, older now, his expression carrying the weight of years she knew nothing about, offered her a small, cautious smile. "I told you I'd stay near, even if I couldn't always be seen." Kai and Ren peered out curiously from behind Lyra's legs, their fear giving way slowly to fascinated curiosity at the sight of the man who had just saved them from very real danger. "How did you find us?" Lyra asked, still struggling to process the sudden, impossible reappearance of a man she had never expected to see again. "I've been keeping watch over Fernbrook for years," he admitted, glancing briefly at the twins with an expression Lyra could not quite decipher. "When I saw the men asking questions around town, I knew trouble would follow eventually. I've been tracking you since you left." Lyra studied him carefully, exhaustion and lingering fear mixing uncomfortably with the strange, unexpected relief of finding an unlikely ally in the middle of such desperate circumstances. "Why? Why would you watch over us for years without ever showing yourself?" The stranger hesitated, his gaze shifting briefly toward Kai and Ren, before returning to Lyra's face. "It's a long story, one I think deserves more than a rushed explanation, in the middle of a dangerous forest. Right now, we need to find somewhere safe. Those men will regroup, and they won't be the last to come searching." Lyra nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his caution, despite the countless questions still burning through her mind. "Do you know somewhere safe?" "I do," he said. "Follow me. I'll explain everything once we're secure." He led them deeper into the forest, moving with confident familiarity, along paths Lyra would never have discovered on her own, eventually arriving at a small, well-hidden cabin, nestled within a dense grove of ancient trees, invisible from any nearby road or common travel path. The cabin was simple but sturdy, clearly maintained carefully, over an extended period, stocked with supplies that suggested regular, deliberate preparation rather than a chance discovery. "This is yours?" Lyra asked, guiding the exhausted twins inside as the stranger secured the door behind them. "It's been useful over the years," he replied vaguely, before turning his attention to building a small fire in the modest hearth, casting warm light across the cabin's simple interior. Kai and Ren, utterly exhausted from days of travel and the terror of the recent encounter, settled quickly onto a small cot near the fire, drifting into uneasy sleep within minutes, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Lyra remained standing near the doorway, watching the stranger work, countless unanswered questions weighing heavily on her mind. "You never told me your name," she said quietly, once the fire crackled steadily, and the immediate danger had faded into cautious calm. He turned to face her fully, firelight casting deep shadows across his features, making him appear older and more solemn than she remembered from that single night years ago. "Corin," he said finally. "My name is Corin." "Corin," Lyra repeated softly, testing the unfamiliar name. "Why have you been protecting us all this time? You don't owe us anything. You barely know me." Corin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, with an expression that suggested a complicated internal struggle. "That night in the garden," he finally said, "I wasn't simply a wounded traveler who happened to wander into the palace grounds." Lyra's stomach tightened with sudden apprehension. "What do you mean?" "I was there because I'd heard rumors, whispers among certain circles, that something was being planned against Damien, something involving manipulation of the sacred mate bond. I went to warn him, but I arrived too late. The ceremony had already gone terribly wrong by the time I made it inside the palace grounds." "You knew," Lyra said slowly, horror and disbelief mixing together in her chest. "You knew what happened to me that night wasn't natural." "I suspected," Corin corrected gently. "I didn't have proof, not then. But everything about that ceremony felt wrong to me. The timing, the sudden shift in Damien's behavior, the way the council seemed almost too satisfied with how everything unfolded." Lyra sank slowly onto a wooden chair near the fire, overwhelmed by the weight of this new information, layered atop everything else she had endured over the past several years. "Why didn't you tell me any of this that night?" "You were already shattered," Corin said softly. "I didn't think unproven suspicions would have helped you in that moment. I only wanted to make sure you weren't completely alone." Lyra studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of deception, finding only quiet sincerity in his steady gaze. "And the years since then? Why continue watching over us in secret, rather than simply telling me the truth?" "Because the people responsible for what happened to you are dangerous and powerful," Corin explained. "If they knew I suspected their involvement, if they knew I was protecting you and the twins, it would have put all of us at even greater risk. I judged it safer to watch quietly from a distance, intervening only when absolutely necessary." "Like tonight," Lyra said. "Like tonight," Corin agreed grimly. They sat together in thoughtful silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound beyond the soft, even breathing of the sleeping twins nearby. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had allowed herself to be with anyone in years. "Those men tonight, they said the children's blood belonged to a powerful kingdom. Do you know what they meant?" Corin's expression grew grave. "I believe those men were sent by the same council members responsible for manipulating Damien's bond ceremony. If they've learned about Kai and Ren, learned that they carry Damien's blood, it's likely they view the twins as a threat to whatever political arrangement they secured through Celine's forced bond with Damien." Lyra's blood ran cold at the implication. "They want to eliminate them. Because they're a threat to Celine's position, to whatever alliance the council secured." "That's my fear, yes," Corin admitted quietly. The weight of this new danger settled heavily over Lyra, far more terrifying than simple discovery or exposure. It was no longer enough to hide her children's true nature from curious townsfolk. Now, powerful, dangerous people actively sought to eliminate them entirely, viewing two innocent children as nothing more than an inconvenient political obstacle. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Corin met her gaze steadily across the firelit cabin. "We keep you and the twins safe, whatever that requires. And eventually, I believe you'll need to consider a possibility you may not be ready to hear yet. What possibility? That the safest place for Kai and Ren, ultimately, might be within Ashbourne Kingdom itself, protected openly, as Damien's true heirs, rather than hidden away where dangerous men can hunt them without consequence. Lyra's chest tightened painfully at the suggestion. Returning to Ashbourne meant facing Damien again, facing the humiliation and heartbreak she had spent years running from, facing a kingdom that had watched her walk away in shame, without a single person stepping forward to help her. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head firmly. I won't go back there. Corin did not push the issue further that night, recognizing the raw pain still evident in her voice, but as Lyra finally drifted into exhausted sleep beside her children, in the safety of the hidden cabin, the seed of that difficult possibility had already been planted, growing steadily alongside the mounting dangers that continued closing in around her small, fragile family. Smoke curled from the chimney of the hidden cabin, as morning light filtered weakly through the dense canopy above, and Lyra woke to the sound of Kai and Ren giggling quietly near the fire, where Corin sat patiently, showing them how to carve small wooden shapes with careful, practiced hands. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected force, a fragile glimpse of the normal family life she had never truly allowed herself to imagine since fleeing Ashbourne years earlier. Good morning, Corin said, glancing up as she stirred from the small cot in the corner. I hope you don't mind. They woke up hungry and curious, and I thought a distraction might help settle their nerves after last night. Thank you, Lyra said softly, watching Ren proudly display a crudely carved wooden bird to her brother, both children's earlier terror seemingly forgotten in the warmth of the morning light, and Corin's steady, patient presence. Over the following days, they remained hidden within the cabin's protective seclusion, Corin using the time to teach Lyra additional defensive techniques she had never learned, skills that might prove essential if further danger found them. He also used the quiet hours to share more of his own history, carefully, deliberately, as trust slowly rebuilt itself between them. Corin, she learned, had once served as a personal guard within Ashbourne's royal court years before Damien's birth, eventually leaving that position after uncovering troubling signs of corruption among certain council members, signs he had been unable to prove conclusively at the time. He had spent years afterward as an independent investigator of sorts, tracking suspicious activities among the kingdom's most powerful families, always careful never to draw direct attention to himself. That's why you were near the palace the night of the wedding, Lyra said one evening, as they sat together outside the cabin, watching Kai and Ren chase fireflies in the fading evening light. You'd been tracking Edric Thorne even then. For years before that, actually, Corin confirmed. I suspected he was manipulating certain political outcomes through illegitimate means, but I never imagined he would go so far as manipulating a mate bond ceremony itself. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, still processing the full scope of what had truly happened on the worst day of her life. All this time, I believed Damien simply changed his mind at the last possible moment. I believed our entire history together meant nothing to him in the end. I don't believe that's true, Corin said gently. Everything I witnessed, everything I've since uncovered, suggests Damien was a victim of this manipulation, just as much as you were, perhaps even more so, given that his own mind and body were directly forced into betraying the person he truly loved. The words settled uncomfortably within Lyra's chest, complicated feelings rising to the surface that she had spent years trying to suppress entirely. Anger, still present despite the passing years. Grief, for the life she had believed was stolen from her. But now, mixed uncomfortably among those familiar emotions, something new and unwelcome. The faint stirring of sympathy for a man who may have suffered his own devastating betrayal that same terrible day. Even if that's true, she said finally, it doesn't change what happened. I still walked out of that hall alone. I still built this entire life without him, protecting our children completely on my own. I understand, Corin said carefully. I'm not suggesting forgiveness comes easily, or that it should be expected of you. I only want you to have the full truth before deciding what path forward makes the most sense for you and the twins. Lyra fell silent, watching Kai stumble over an exposed root while chasing after a particularly elusive firefly, Ren's delighted laughter echoing through the quiet evening air. Whatever complicated feelings remained about Damien, about the truth Corin continued gradually revealing, Her children's safety remained her absolute priority above all else. "Those men who attacked us," she said eventually, changing the subject slightly. "Do you think they'll try again?" Corin's expression grew serious. "I believe it's very likely. Men like that rarely give up after a single failed attempt, especially when the stakes involve securing significant political power." "Then we can't stay here indefinitely," Lyra said, voicing the realization that had been building within her over recent days. "Eventually, they'll expand their search, find this location too. Probably within a few weeks, if they're determined enough," Corin agreed. "Which brings us back to the difficult question of where you and the twins can find lasting safety." Lyra sighed heavily, the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her once again. "You still believe returning to Ashbourne is the safest option?" "I believe it's the option that offers Kai and Ren the strongest, most permanent protection," Corin clarified. As acknowledged heirs to the Ashbourne throne, protected openly by Damien's authority and the full strength of the kingdom's warriors, they would be far more difficult targets than they currently are, hidden and vulnerable, relying solely on us for protection. "And if Damien rejects them the way he rejected me?" Lyra asked, old fears resurfacing sharply. "If this manipulation theory is wrong, and he simply doesn't want children born from that night?" "I don't believe that's a realistic concern," Corin said gently. "From everything I've learned over recent years, Damien has spent considerable effort searching for you since your disappearance. His guilt over what happened that day appears genuine and significant." Lyra considered this information carefully, old wounds and new possibilities warring uncomfortably within her chest. She was not ready, not yet, to fully trust the idea of returning to a kingdom that had witnessed her deepest humiliation, of facing a man whose rejection had once shattered her so completely. But the growing danger surrounding her children left her with increasingly limited options. "I need more time to think," she said finally. "That's fair," Corin agreed. "We have at least a few weeks before those men are likely to locate this cabin. Use that time wisely." Over the following days, Lyra found herself watching Corin interact with Kai and Ren, with growing curiosity, noting the natural patience he displayed, the genuine warmth beneath his otherwise guarded exterior. The twins, remarkably, had taken to him with an ease that surprised her, Kai following him around eagerly during simple daily tasks, Ren often curling up beside him during quiet evening hours, apparently drawn to his steady, calming presence. "They like you," Lyra observed one evening, watching Corin patiently answer Kai's endless stream of curious questions about forest survival skills. "Children tend to sense genuine intentions more clearly than adults sometimes do," Corin replied with a small smile. "Perhaps that's why they've accepted my presence so readily, despite everything they've been through recently." Lyra studied him thoughtfully, an unspoken question lingering just beneath the surface of her mind, one she had avoided directly addressing since first realizing her pregnancy years earlier. "Corin," she said carefully, "that night in the garden, years ago, I need to understand exactly what happened between us." Corin's expression grew momentarily guarded, though he did not look away from her steady gaze. "I've wondered when you might ask that directly." "I don't remember many specific details," Lyra admitted. "Only comfort, connection, exhaustion. I've spent years wondering exactly how Kai and Ren came to exist, unable to fully piece together the specifics of that single night." Corin was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with obvious care. Wolves in crisis sometimes form temporary, powerful connections during moments of extreme emotional vulnerability. What happened between us that night wasn't planned by either of us. I believe we were both drawn together by grief and loneliness, in ways neither of us fully controlled or anticipated. Lyra absorbed this explanation slowly, pieces of a confusing puzzle finally settling into clearer focus. "Do the twins know that you might be?" She trailed off, unable to fully voice the question directly. "I haven't said anything," Corin confirmed. "I wasn't certain how you would want to handle that information, or whether you even wanted confirmation of my involvement at all." "I appreciate that," Lyra said softly, genuinely grateful for his careful consideration of her feelings throughout this entire complicated situation. "I need more time before deciding how, or if, to explain any of this to them." "Take whatever time you need," Corin said gently. "I'm not going anywhere, regardless of what you eventually decide." As the days passed within the safety of the hidden cabin, Lyra found herself increasingly drawn to Corin's steady, reassuring presence, grateful beyond words for his protection and support during the most dangerous period of her life since fleeing Ashbourne years earlier. But beneath that growing gratitude and connection, the looming question of Damien, of the twins' true birthright, of the danger that continued closing in around them regardless of how carefully they hid, remained unresolved, growing more urgent with every passing day. Nearly 2 weeks into their stay at the cabin, Corin returned from a routine perimeter check with troubling news that confirmed Lyra's worst fears. "They've found the general area," he reported grimly, entering the cabin with visible tension in his usually calm demeanor. "I spotted tracks nearby, careful and deliberate, clearly searching rather than simply passing through." Lyra's heart sank as she pulled Kai and Ren instinctively closer. "How much time do we have?" "Days, at most," Corin said. "We need to make a decision soon." Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down upon her with renewed urgency. Continuing to run indefinitely, staying perpetually one step ahead of increasingly determined and dangerous pursuers, or finally confronting the painful past she had spent years desperately avoiding, returning to Ashbourne Kingdom and the man whose rejection had once shattered her entire world. Neither option offered easy comfort, but as she looked down at Kai and Ren, innocent and unaware of the true danger surrounding them, Lyra understood, with growing certainty, that her own personal pain could no longer remain the deciding factor in whatever choice she made next. "Corin," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the fear still churning within her chest, "I think it's time you told me everything you know about reaching Ashbourne safely, without drawing further attention, until we're ready to face whatever waits for us there." Corin met her gaze with quiet, steady support. "I'll help you every step of the way, whatever you decide." For the first time since fleeing that hidden cabin's safety became necessary, Lyra allowed herself to consider seriously the possibility she had spent years running from, the possibility of finally returning home, not as the humiliated bride who once fled in shame, but as a mother fiercely determined to secure her children's safety and rightful place in the world, regardless of the painful truths that awaited her there. Steel clashed briefly in the training yard as Damien drove his opponent backward with a series of sharp, controlled strikes, releasing weeks of pent-up frustration through the familiar discipline of combat practice. He had returned from Fernbrook 3 days earlier, empty-handed and heartsick, having arrived at Lyra's abandoned cottage just days too late, finding only cold hearths and neighbors who spoke in confused, worried tones about the healer and her twins who had vanished suddenly in the middle of the night. He lowered his sword finally, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his face despite the cool morning air. His training partner backed away respectfully, sensing the king's foul mood extended well beyond simple physical exertion. Celine approached from across the yard, her expression carrying the same tension that had gripped the entire castle since Damien's return. "Any new word from the scouts?" she asked. "Nothing useful," Damien admitted, wiping sweat from his brow with a cloth handed to him by a nearby attendant. Whoever helped her disappear from Fernbrook knew exactly what they were doing. No trail, no witnesses willing to speak clearly about where she went. "She's protecting the children," Celine said quietly. "Whatever drove her to leave so suddenly, it's clear she's still doing everything possible to keep them safe." Damien nodded grimly, the knowledge that he had genuine twin children, children he had never met, weighing heavily on him every waking moment since learning of their existence. "I need to find her, Celine, not just for my own sake, but because clearly something dangerous is happening. People fleeing in the middle of the night don't do so without serious cause." "I agree," Celine said. "But we also can't lose focus on exposing Edric. If he's responsible for what happened at our wedding, he may also be connected to whatever danger is now threatening Lyra and the twins." Damien's jaw tightened at the mention of Edric's name, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Their investigation had continued steadily during his brief absence, Celine gathering additional evidence while he searched fruitlessly for Lyra's trail. They now possessed enough documented proof, carefully compiled testimonies, financial records, and physical evidence regarding the specific herbs used to manipulate his mind that day, to bring formal charges against Edric before the full council. "We move against him today," Damien said firmly, decision crystallizing within him after weeks of careful, patient preparation. I've waited long enough. Celine nodded firmly, matching his resolve. I'll gather the council members we can trust. We'll need their support to ensure Edric's allies can't simply dismiss the charges. Within hours, the full council had assembled within the Great Hall, the same hall where Damien's wedding ceremony had gone so catastrophically wrong years earlier. Edric Thorne stood near his usual position, confident and composed as always, clearly unaware of the confrontation about to unfold. Damien stood before the assembled council, Celine positioned firmly beside him, the carefully compiled evidence spread across the table between them. 3 years ago, Damien began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. On the day of my wedding, I was deliberately drugged and manipulated into rejecting Lyra Voss and falsely bonding with Celine instead. Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members, shock and confusion crossing many faces, though Edric's expression remained carefully controlled, betraying only the faintest flicker of tension. These are serious accusations, Edric said calmly. Do you have proof to support such claims, my king? I do, Damien replied, gesturing toward the documented evidence before him. Testimonies from servants who witnessed suspicious preparations before the ceremony. Financial records showing significant payments made by you to a merchant known for supplying rare herbs capable of disrupting natural wolf instincts. And a merchant himself, willing to testify that you personally purchased those exact herbs in the weeks leading up to my wedding. Edric's composure finally cracked slightly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around the hall, gauging the reactions of his fellow council members. This is a fabrication, he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Someone is clearly trying to damage my reputation. The evidence speaks clearly enough, Celine interjected firmly. I've felt for years that our bond was never genuine. I believe you engineered that ceremony to secure political advantage through my family's territory, regardless of the devastating personal cost to everyone involved. Edric's expression hardened, recognizing the mounting evidence against him could no longer be easily dismissed. Everything I did, he said finally, abandoning his earlier denials, was for the good of this kingdom. Lyra Voss offered nothing politically. Celine's family controls trade routes, essential to our continued prosperity. I made a difficult decision that ultimately served Ashbourne's greater interests. Gasps echoed through the hall at his open admission, several council members exchanging horrified glances at the casual manner in which Edric justified his manipulation. You had no right to make that decision for me, Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, years of carefully controlled anger finally surfacing fully. You stole my ability to choose my own mate, humiliated a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, and caused irreparable harm to countless lives, all to serve your own political ambitions. The kingdom benefited, Edric insisted stubbornly. Trade with the Eastern Territories has flourished under this arrangement. At what cost? Celine demanded sharply. Lyra Voss vanished from this kingdom in complete devastation. She spent years hiding, raising twin children alone, likely in danger from forces connected to your own manipulation. Edric's confidence faltered visibly at the mention of twins, and Damien noticed immediately, stepping forward with renewed intensity. You know about the twins, he said, understanding dawning with cold, furious clarity. You're the one who sent men after them. Edric remained silent, his expression tightening with the recognition that his careful schemes had finally, irreversibly unraveled. Guards, Damien commanded sharply, and immediately, castle guards stepped forward, moving to secure Edric before he could attempt any further deception or escape. Edric Thorne, you are hereby stripped of your council position and placed under arrest, pending full investigation into your crimes against this kingdom and its people. As guards led Edric from the hall, the assembled council members remaining in stunned, uncomfortable silence, Damien turned toward Celine, relief and continued anxiety mixing within his expression. We finally have proof, he said quietly. But if Edric sent men after Lyra and the children, they could already be in serious danger. Then we need to find them immediately, Celine said firmly, before Edric's men succeed in whatever he originally ordered them to do. Damien nodded grimly, already calculating his next steps, dispatching messengers to recall his search parties with renewed urgency, ordering additional warriors prepared for immediate deployment toward Fernbrook and the surrounding territories where Lyra had last been sighted. As the great hall slowly emptied around him, council members departing in hushed, worried conversations about the shocking revelations they had just witnessed. Damien remained standing near the very spot where his wedding ceremony had unraveled years earlier, the weight of guilt and renewed determination settling heavily across his shoulders. He had finally uncovered the truth behind that devastating day, finally exposed the man responsible for stealing his choice and causing so much unnecessary suffering. But knowing the truth offered little comfort, while Lyra and his children remained somewhere out there, hidden and vulnerable, potentially still hunted by dangers set into motion by Edric's ruthless ambition. "We'll find them," Celine said softly, sensing his troubled thoughts as she moved to stand beside him. "Whatever it takes." Damien nodded, determination hardening within him, despite the fear still gnawing at his chest. He had spent years searching fruitlessly for Lyra, carrying guilt and regret over a choice that had never truly been his own. Now, finally armed with the truth and the full resources of his kingdom, no longer constrained by Edric's hidden manipulation, he intended to find her, to protect his children, and to finally offer Lyra the truth and the apology she deserved, regardless of how difficult that reunion might ultimately prove to be. Outside the castle walls, warriors began assembling swiftly under Damien's urgent orders, preparing to ride out toward Fernbrook and beyond, searching every possible route Lyra might have taken in her desperate flight to protect their children. Damien himself prepared to lead the search personally, unwilling to remain idle within the castle, while his family remained in danger somewhere beyond his reach. As dusk settled over Ashbourne Kingdom, the search party rode out through the castle gates, torches blazing against the gathering darkness, carrying with them not just Damien's desperate hope of reunion, but the full weight of justice finally being served against the man who had stolen years of happiness from everyone involved in that fateful, manipulated wedding day. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unaware that Damien now rode toward her with the truth finally exposed, Lyra continued her own difficult journey back toward the kingdom she had fled, carrying with her the same desperate hope that perhaps, finally, safety and truth might await her and her children at the end of this long, painful road. Hooves thundered against packed dirt as Lyra pressed herself flat against the rocky outcrop, one hand clamped firmly over Ren's mouth, the other holding Kai tightly against her side, both children trembling silently as three riders passed dangerously close along the narrow trail below. Corin crouched beside her, perfectly still, his eyes tracking the riders' movements with sharp, calculating focus, until the sound of hooves finally faded into the distance. "That's the second group today," Lyra whispered once it was safe to speak again, her heart still pounding painfully against her ribs. "They're getting closer. They know we're heading toward Ashbourne's borders now," Corin replied grimly. "It won't take them much longer to anticipate our route entirely." They had left the hidden cabin 4 days earlier, moving carefully and deliberately toward Ashbourne Kingdom, avoiding main roads whenever possible, relying on Corin's extensive knowledge of lesser-known paths through dense forests and rugged terrain. But their pursuers, whoever they truly were, had proven relentlessly persistent, closing the gap between them with unsettling speed and precision. "How much farther?" Lyra asked, exhaustion evident in her strained voice, as she helped Ren adjust her small pack, the weight clearly becoming burdensome for such young shoulders. 2 more days, if we maintain this pace, Corin estimated, scanning the surrounding terrain carefully, before signaling it was safe to continue moving. "Perhaps less, if we push harder, though I worry about the children's stamina." Kai, despite his obvious exhaustion, straightened his small shoulders with determined bravery. "I can walk faster," he insisted, though his wobbling legs betrayed the depth of his fatigue. Lyra smiled softly, despite the exhausting circumstances, pride swelling within her chest at her son's fierce determination. "We'll go as fast as we safely can," she promised, ruffling his hair gently, before rising to continue their careful journey. They pressed onward through increasingly rugged terrain, the landscape growing rockier and more treacherous as they approached Ashbourne's outer borders. Corin remained constantly vigilant, frequently pausing to check for signs of pursuit, his expression growing steadily more concerned as the day progressed. By late afternoon, exhaustion had settled heavily over the entire group, Ren stumbling repeatedly despite her best efforts, Kai's earlier bravado fading into quiet, determined silence as fatigue overtook him fully. Lyra alternated carrying each child as needed, her own strength tested to its absolute limits by the demanding pace Corin insisted upon maintaining. "We need to rest," she finally said, as the sun began sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. "The children can't continue much further without proper rest." Corin hesitated, clearly torn between the urgent need for continued progress and genuine concern for the children's well-being. "There's a small ravine ahead," he finally conceded. "We can rest there for a few hours before continuing under cover of darkness." They reached the shallow ravine just as the last light faded from the sky, settling into the relative safety of its rocky walls, sharing a modest meal of dried provisions, before the exhausted twins finally succumbed to much-needed sleep, curled together beneath a single worn blanket. Lyra remained awake, watching over her sleeping children, while Corin kept careful watch at the ravine's edge, scanning the darkening landscape for any sign of continued pursuit. She joined him quietly after ensuring the twins were settled comfortably, sitting beside him in the cool evening air. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked softly, voicing the fear that had been building steadily throughout their exhausting journey. Corin was quiet for a long moment before answering honestly, "I believe so, but I won't pretend the coming days will be easy. Whoever is coordinating this pursuit is clearly well organized and determined." "If something happens," Lyra said carefully, forcing herself to voice thoughts she had been avoiding, "if I'm not able to protect them myself, I need you to promise you'll get Kai and Ren to safety, regardless of what happens to me." Corin turned to face her fully, his expression firm and resolute despite the exhaustion evident in his own features. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said firmly. "I won't allow it." "You can't promise that," Lyra said softly. "None of us can control everything that might happen out here." "Perhaps not," Corin agreed, "but I can promise you this much. I will protect all three of you with everything I have, for as long as I'm able." "That's a promise I intend to keep, regardless of the danger involved." Lyra studied his determined expression in the dim moonlight, gratitude, and something else, something warmer and more complicated, stirring quietly within her exhausted heart. Before she could respond further, a sharp, distant sound cut through the quiet night, unmistakably the snap of a twig beneath careful footsteps somewhere along the ravine's rim above them. Corin tensed immediately, rising silently to his feet, gesturing urgently for Lyra to wake the children and prepare to move. Her heart pounding with renewed fear, Lyra roused Kai and Ren quickly, whispering urgent reassurances as she gathered their few belongings, following Corin's careful lead toward a narrow, hidden passage along the ravine's opposite side. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, the twins remarkably compliant despite their obvious fear, sensing the seriousness of their situation without needing further explanation. Behind them, the sound of multiple footsteps grew increasingly audible, confirming Lyra's worst fears that their pursuers had finally caught up. "Run," Corin whispered urgently, positioning himself protectively behind them as they emerged from the narrow passage into a moonlit clearing beyond. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." "I'm not leaving you," Lyra insisted fiercely, even as she continued moving Kai and Ren forward as instructed. "You have to protect them," Corin said firmly, already shifting into his powerful wolf form as the first pursuer emerged from the passage behind them. "Please, Lyra. Trust me." Torn between desperate loyalty to Corin and overwhelming instinct to protect her children, Lyra hesitated only a moment before continuing forward with Kai and Ren, forcing herself to trust that Corin could handle the immediate threat behind them, while she focused entirely on securing her children's safety. Behind her, the sounds of fierce combat erupted, snarls and shouts echoing through the quiet night as Corin engaged their pursuers with fierce, determined intensity. Lyra pushed forward desperately, Kai and Ren clinging tightly to her hands as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain as quickly as their exhausted bodies allowed. They had traveled perhaps a quarter mile when a new sound reached her ears, distinct from the fading combat behind them, the unmistakable thunder of numerous approaching riders from the direction they were currently heading. Lyra's heart sank with renewed terror, certain for a devastating moment that they had run directly into additional pursuers, effectively trapped between two separate groups of dangerous hunters, with nowhere left to flee. She pulled Kai and Ren behind a cluster of dense bushes, pressing a shaking finger against her lips to ensure their silence, watching with growing dread as the approaching riders drew steadily closer through the moonlit darkness. But as the lead rider finally came into clearer view, moonlight catching against distinctly familiar armor and features, Lyra's breath caught sharply in her throat, disbelief and overwhelming emotion crashing over her simultaneously. It was Damien. For a single, frozen heartbeat, Lyra could not move, could not breathe, staring at the man she had spent years trying desperately to forget, now sitting astride his horse mere yards away, his expression shifting rapidly, from fierce determination to stunned, overwhelming recognition, as his eyes finally landed on her. "Lyra," Damien breathed, his voice barely audible, yet somehow carrying clearly across the moonlit clearing between them. Behind her, Kai and Ren peered out cautiously from their hiding place, sensing the sudden shift in their mother's demeanor, curious and confused by the unexpected arrival of so many armed riders. Before Lyra could fully process the surreal reality of Damien's sudden appearance, sounds of continued combat echoed from the direction they had just fled, sharp and urgent enough to shatter the stunned silence between them. "Corin," Lyra gasped, memory of the danger they had just escaped crashing back over her with renewed urgency. "He's fighting them alone. Please, you have to help him." Damien's expression hardened immediately, years of confusion and longing shifting instantly into focused, protective action. He turned sharply toward his warriors, issuing rapid commands that sent half his search party racing toward the sounds of combat, while he remained behind with the rest, dismounting quickly to approach Lyra and the children, with careful, deliberate steps. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her exhausted, travel-worn appearance with obvious concern. "Are the children safe?" "We're fine," Lyra managed, still struggling to reconcile the reality of Damien's presence with years of careful avoidance and painful memory. Exhausted, frightened, but unharmed. Damien's gaze shifted then toward the bushes where Kai and Ren remained partially hidden, his breath catching visibly as he finally laid eyes on his children for the very first time. Slowly, cautiously, he lowered himself to their level, careful not to appear threatening despite his commanding presence. "Hello," he said softly, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion. "My name is Damien." Kai stepped forward first, curious, despite his exhaustion, studying the stranger's face, with the same unfiltered directness only young children possessed. "You have the same eyes as me," he observed simply. Damien's composure cracked slightly at the innocent observation, tears he had not expected gathering unexpectedly in his eyes. "Yes," he confirmed softly. "I believe we do." Ren, more cautious than her brother, remained close against Lyra's side, watching the emotional exchange with careful, guarded curiosity. Lyra placed a gentle, reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering silent comfort, while she continued processing the overwhelming reality unfolding before her. "Their names are Kai and Ren," Lyra said quietly, watching Damien's reaction carefully. "Kai and Ren," Damien repeated softly, testing the names as though committing them permanently to memory. He looked up at Lyra then, raw emotion evident across his features. "They're truly mine?" "Yes," Lyra confirmed, her own voice unsteady with the weight of years of secrets finally being spoken aloud. From that night in the garden, understanding dawned slowly across Damien's expression, pieces of a complicated puzzle finally settling into place. "The stranger you mentioned that night, years ago, before you disappeared, that was..." "Corin," Lyra finished for him. "Yes." Before further explanation could continue, sounds of returning riders interrupted their emotional reunion. Damien's dispatched warriors, emerging from the darkness, supporting a visibly injured, but alive Corin between them. Lyra rushed forward immediately, relief flooding through her at the sight of him still breathing, despite the concerning amount of blood staining his torn clothing. "He fought bravely," one of the warriors reported to Damien. "We arrived just in time to help him finish off the remaining attackers. 2 of them managed to escape, but we captured one alive for questioning." Damien nodded grimly, immediately ordering his healers forward to attend to Corin's injuries, while directing additional warriors to secure the surrounding area against any further threats. "You saved my family," Damien said, approaching Corin directly, as the healers worked carefully on his wounds. "I owe you a debt I'm not certain I can ever fully repay." Corin managed a weak, pained smile, despite his obvious exhaustion and injury. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said simply, his eyes flickering meaningfully toward Lyra and the twins nearby. As the immediate crisis settled into cautious relief, Damien turned his attention back toward Lyra, countless years of separation and unspoken pain hanging heavily in the air between them. "Lyra," he said carefully, "I know an explanation is long overdue between us. I need you to know the truth about what happened on our wedding day." Lyra studied him carefully, exhaustion and lingering caution mixing uncomfortably with the desperate hope she had spent years trying to suppress entirely. "I'm listening," she said finally. Over the following hour, as camp was carefully established around them and the children finally settled into much-needed rest under Celine's gentle, watchful care, Damien explained everything he had uncovered: the manipulation, the forbidden herbs, Edric's ruthless political scheming, and the recent confrontation that had finally exposed the truth before the full council. Lyra listened in stunned, painful silence, years of carefully constructed anger and hurt shifting uncomfortably, as the full scope of what had truly happened settled over her. She had spent years believing Damien had simply chosen someone else, that their entire history together had meant nothing when weighed against a sudden, overwhelming attraction to Celine. Learning the devastating truth, that his mind and body had been deliberately manipulated against his will, complicated emotions she had believed were long since resolved. "I searched for you constantly," Damien continued, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I never stopped believing something had gone terribly wrong that day, even before I had proof. I'm so sorry, Lyra, for everything you've endured because of choices that were stolen from both of us." Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, overwhelmed by the flood of complicated emotions crashing over her simultaneously. "I don't know how to process all of this," she admitted honestly. "I've spent years building a life completely separate from you, protecting our children entirely on my own. Learning the truth doesn't simply erase everything I've been through." "I understand," Damien said gently. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything immediately, or to simply return to how things once were between us. I only want the opportunity to be part of Kai and Ren's lives, to help protect them properly, and to make amends for everything you've suffered because of what was done to us both." Lyra glanced toward her sleeping children, peaceful now under Celine's careful watch, then toward Corin, resting nearby as healers finished tending his wounds, and finally back toward Damien, whose expression carried genuine, undeniable sincerity, despite everything that had happened between them. "The children deserve safety," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil still churning within her. "Real, lasting safety, not the constant fear we've lived under for years. If returning to Ashbourne offers that protection, then I'm willing to consider it, for their sake." "And for your own sake?" Damien asked carefully. Lyra hesitated, unable to offer a simple, immediate answer to such a complicated question. "I need time," she said honestly. "Time to understand everything that's happened. Time to figure out what role, if any, you should truly play in our lives going forward." Damien nodded, respecting her cautious honesty, despite the clear disappointment evident in his expression. "That's fair," he said. "Whatever time you need, I'll respect that boundary completely." As dawn began breaking gently over the horizon, casting soft golden light across the makeshift camp, Lyra found herself standing at the edge of an entirely new chapter in her complicated, difficult life, one that promised neither simple resolution nor easy answers, but perhaps, finally, the possibility of genuine safety and truth for her children after years of desperate, exhausting flight. Behind her, Kai and Ren stirred awake slowly, blinking sleepily in the early morning light, unaware of just how dramatically their small family's future had shifted overnight. Ahead of her, Ashbourne Kingdom waited, complicated and uncertain, holding both painful memories and the possibility of a very different kind of future than the one she had believed was lost to her forever. Trumpets sounded across Ashbourne Kingdom as Lyra stood at the edge of the Great Hall once again, 3 weeks after her unexpected reunion with Damien along that moonlit forest road, staring at the very same doors she had once fled through in complete devastation years earlier. This time, however, she did not stand alone in a wedding dress, uncertain and hopeful. This time, Kai and Ren stood beside her, dressed in fine clothing befitting their true heritage, while Corin, fully recovered from his injuries, stood protectively nearby. The past 3 weeks had tested Lyra's resolve in countless ways. She had watched carefully as Damien worked tirelessly to dismantle the remaining corruption within his council, ensuring Edric's co-conspirators faced appropriate consequences for their involvement in the years of manipulation and danger her family had endured. She had spoken privately with Celine multiple times, surprised to find genuine understanding and even friendship developing between them, both women united by their shared experience of manipulation at Edric's calculating hands. She had also spent considerable time simply observing Damien interact with Kai and Ren, watching carefully for any sign of insincerity or hesitation in his growing bond with the children he had only recently learned existed. What she witnessed instead was genuine, patient devotion, Damien learning their individual personalities with careful attention, Kai's fierce curiosity, and Ren's quiet, observant nature, never pushing too hard, always respecting the careful boundaries Lyra continued maintaining around their still complicated relationship. Today marked a pivotal moment in that ongoing, careful reconciliation. Damien had called for a full public gathering within the Great Hall, determined to formally acknowledge Kai and Ren as his true heirs before the entire kingdom, publicly exposing the manipulation that had caused so much unnecessary suffering years earlier. "Are you ready?" Corin asked quietly, standing beside Lyra as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "As ready as I'll ever be," Lyra admitted, smoothing Ren's dress nervously, while Kai fidgeted excitedly beside her, clearly more thrilled than nervous about the upcoming ceremony. The great doors swung open finally, revealing the packed hall beyond, hundreds of curious, expectant faces turning toward them as they began their slow walk down the same aisle Lyra had once fled years earlier, in complete humiliation. This time, however, she walked with her head held high, her children beside her, no longer the heartbroken, abandoned bride, but a fierce, protective mother, finally claiming the truth and justice owed to her family. Damien waited at the altar, dressed formally in his ceremonial armor, his expression carrying both nervous anticipation and unmistakable pride, as he watched Lyra and their children approach. Beside him, Celine stood in careful support, having personally insisted on being present for this important, healing moment. As Lyra and the twins reached the altar, Damien stepped forward, addressing the assembled crowd with clear, steady authority. 3 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, I stood in this very spot and made a choice that was never truly mine to make. I was deliberately manipulated through forbidden means by a member of my own council, forced into rejecting the woman I loved and falsely bonding with someone else entirely, all to serve corrupt political ambitions that had nothing to do with genuine happiness or justice. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, many recalling clearly the shocking events of that fateful wedding day, understanding now finally dawning regarding the truth behind such dramatic, unexpected behavior. Lyra Voss, Damien continued, turning toward her with genuine, open emotion, suffered unimaginable hardship because of choices stolen from us both. She fled this kingdom in complete devastation, unaware she was carrying our children, and she has spent years protecting them entirely alone, facing danger and hardship with remarkable strength and courage. He knelt then, before the entire assembled kingdom, before Lyra and their children, an unprecedented gesture from a reigning Alpha King that sent fresh waves of astonished murmurs through the crowd. I cannot undo the pain and suffering caused by choices that were never truly my own, Damien said, his voice thick with genuine remorse and determination. But I can promise, before this entire kingdom, that I will spend the rest of my life making amends, protecting Lyra and our children, and ensuring nothing like this manipulation is ever again allowed to threaten the genuine happiness and safety of anyone within Ashbourne Kingdom. He rose slowly, turning to formally address Kai and Ren directly, his expression softening with unmistakable paternal affection. Kai Ashbourne and Ren Ashbourne, he announced formally, I hereby recognize you both as my true heirs, entitled to every protection and privilege owed to your rightful place within this kingdom. The hall erupted into a mixture of stunned murmurs and gradually building applause, the assembled crowd slowly absorbing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. A king publicly acknowledging past wrongs, formally claiming previously unknown heirs, and demonstrating genuine accountability in a manner few had ever witnessed from Ashbourne's ruling family. Lyra watched the proceedings with overwhelming emotion, years of pain and uncertainty finally beginning to heal, in ways she had never truly believed possible. She glanced toward Kai and Ren, their faces bright with confused but genuine excitement at the formal recognition, then toward Corin, whose supportive presence had carried her family through their darkest, most dangerous days. As the formal ceremony concluded, and the crowd began dispersing into celebratory conversation, Damien approached Lyra privately, his expression carrying careful hope rather than presumptuous expectation. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for allowing this. For giving our children the chance to know their true heritage, regardless of whatever you ultimately decide about us." Lyra studied him thoughtfully, 3 weeks of careful observation and gradual healing, settling into a clearer understanding of her own complicated feelings. "I still need time," she said honestly, "but I no longer believe returning here was the wrong choice. Watching you with Kai and Ren these past weeks, seeing the genuine effort you've made to right past wrongs, it's helped me understand that perhaps healing, real healing, might actually be possible for all of us." Damien nodded, respecting her continued caution, while clearly grateful for the genuine progress evident in her words. "Whatever pace you need," he said sincerely, "I'll be here, patiently, for as long as it takes." Over the following months, Lyra gradually settled into her new, complicated life within Ashbourne Kingdom, watching carefully as Kai and Ren flourished under the combined attention of Damien, Celine, and Corin, who had chosen to remain nearby as a trusted advisor and continued protector for the family he had helped save through the darkest days of their dangerous journey. Edric Thorne faced formal justice for his crimes, stripped permanently of any political power, and exiled from Ashbourne's territory entirely, a clear message sent throughout the kingdom that such manipulation and corruption would never again be tolerated within the royal court. Celine, freed finally from the false bond that had constrained her for years, found genuine happiness eventually, with a warrior from a neighboring territory, her friendship with Lyra deepening steadily over time. Both women bonded permanently by their shared experience of manipulation and their mutual determination to build genuine, healthy lives moving forward. And slowly, carefully, Lyra allowed herself to consider the possibility of a future with Damien once again, not rushing back into the relationship stolen from them years earlier, but building something new and genuine from the painful lessons they had both learned, grounded now in complete honesty and hard-earned trust, rather than the fragile assumptions that had once defined their childhood connection. Kai and Ren grew steadily into their true heritage, Kai displaying natural leadership qualities that hinted at future alpha potential, Ren developing remarkable diplomatic instincts that suggested a promising future, guiding the kingdom's political affairs alongside her brother. Both children carried, unmistakably, the strength and resilience of a mother who had protected them fiercely through years of danger and uncertainty, combined with the genuine devotion of a father determined to make amends for circumstances entirely beyond his original control. On a quiet evening nearly a year after that dramatic public reconciliation, Lyra stood once again in the palace gardens, where her entire complicated journey had truly begun, watching Kai and Ren chase each other playfully beneath the same willow tree, where Corin had once offered her quiet comfort during the darkest night of her life. Damien approached slowly, settling beside her with careful, respectful distance. "They're happy here," he observed softly, watching their children's carefree laughter echo through the peaceful evening air. "They are," Lyra agreed, genuine warmth evident in her voice for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. "We all are, finally." Damien glanced toward her carefully, hope evident in his expression despite his continued patience. "Does that include you?" he asked gently. Lyra considered the question seriously, reflecting on the long, difficult journey that had brought her back to this exact garden, back to this complicated, healing relationship with the man whose choice had once devastated her completely, though never truly by his own genuine will. "Yes," she said finally, offering him a small, genuine smile that carried none of the careful guardedness that had defined their interactions for so many months. "I believe it does." As the sun set gently over Ashbourne Kingdom, casting warm golden light across the peaceful garden, Lyra Voss finally allowed herself to embrace the possibility of genuine happiness once again. Surrounded by her children, supported by trusted friends who had proven their loyalty through the darkest possible circumstances, and standing beside a man who had spent an entire year proving, through consistent action rather than empty words, that he was truly worthy of the second chance she had finally, cautiously, decided to offer him. The kingdom that had once witnessed her deepest humiliation now stood as living proof that even the most devastating betrayals could eventually give way to genuine healing, that truth and accountability could triumph over manipulation and corruption, and that sometimes the most painful beginnings could still lead, eventually, toward the kind of hard-earned happiness that no manufactured bond or forced ceremony could ever truly replicate.